esteem. When people hear the word silence, they often mistake it for weakness. They imagine it as backing down, giving up, or swallowing injustice. But silence, esteem, in the context of dealing with narcissistic behavior, is none of those things. It isn't avoidance, and it certainly isn't surrender. Silence, when used intentionally, is a boundary, esteem. And boundaries don't need speeches. They don't need justifications. They simply exist. If you've ever tried to reason with a narcissistic person, you already know how exhausting that road is, esteem. You explain, they twist. You clarify, they deflect. You defend yourself, and suddenly you're the problem. Every conversation becomes a courtroom where the rules keep changing, esteem, and somehow you're always on trial. That's because the narcissistic dynamic isn't about understanding, it's about control. Engagement is the currency and emotional reaction is the payoff, esteem. Silence interrupts that economy. When you stop reacting, something profound happens. The narcissist loses their mirror. They rely on your emotional responses, your confusion, your anger, esteem, your attempts to be fair to regulate their sense of power. Without that feedback, they feel destabilized. And this is where many people get uncomfortable, esteem, because silence feels unnatural when you've been trained to explain yourself, to keep the peace, to prove you're not what they say you are. But here's the truth, esteem. Every explanation you offer is an invitation to be manipulated. Silence is not the same as shutting down. It's not stonewalling. Stonewalling is a punishment, esteem. Silence as a boundary is self-protection. It's choosing not to participate in a rigged game. You're not withholding to hurt them, esteem. You're withholding access to your inner world because it's no longer safe to share it. At first, silence often provokes escalation. The texts get longer, the accusations get louder, esteem. The tone shifts from charm to cruelty, from victimhood to rage. And this is the part where people panic and think, see, silence made it worse. But what's actually happening is exposure, esteem. The mask depends on your participation. When you step back, the cracks appear. And here's something important: silence doesn't mean you don't speak at all. It means you stop explaining, esteem, defending, and emotionally justifying your reality. You can still communicate facts, you can still say no, you can still set limits, but you do it without the emotional labor. No backstory, esteem, no persuasive essay, no hope that this time they'll finally understand. A simple, calm response, or no response at all, changes the power dynamic, esteem, because narcissistic patterns feed on intensity. They thrive in arguments, in emotional storms, in long conversations that go nowhere. Silence flattens that terrain, esteem. It removes the highs and lows, and without those emotional spikes, the manipulation loses traction. Many people worry that silence will make them look guilty, cold, or uncaring. But remember, esteem, narcissistic systems already frame you as the villain the moment you stop complying. You don't win by being perceived as good. You win by being free. Silence is not about image management, esteem. It's about reclaiming your nervous system. Over time, your silence sends a clear, unspoken message, esteem. I no longer need your approval to trust my reality. And that message lands louder than any confrontation ever could. You're no longer explaining why something hurt, esteem. You're no longer asking for empathy that never arrives. You're no longer trying to be seen by someone who benefits from not seeing you. This is where silence becomes deeply revealing, esteem. When you stop filling the space, the narcissist fills it for you. They may contradict themselves, they may project, esteem. They may become increasingly obvious in their entitlement or lack of empathy. Others begin to notice the imbalance, not because you told them, but because you stopped buffering it, esteem. Silence also creates room for something else, your clarity. When the noise fades, you begin to hear your own instincts again, esteem. You realize how much energy went into managing someone else's emotions, how often you abandoned yourself to keep things smooth. Silence gives you back that energy, esteem. It allows you to observe instead of react, to choose instead of comply. And perhaps the most radical part of silence as a boundary is this: it doesn't ask for permission, esteem. You don't need them to agree with it. You don't need them to understand it. Boundaries are not negotiations. They are declarations of what you will and will not participate in. Eventually, esteem, the narcissist feels this shift. They may accuse you of changing, becoming distant, or being selfish. And in a way, they're right. You have changed, esteem. You've stopped centering your life around their reactions. You've stopped offering your emotional bandwidth as a public resource. You've stopped speaking into a void. And that's the unmasking, esteem. Not because you said anything brilliant, but because you stopped saying anything at all. Silence doesn't shout, it doesn't accuse. It simply stands firm, and in that quiet, esteem, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Once you stop reacting and over-explaining, something else begins to matter far more than anything you say: consistency, esteem. And this is where narcissistic patterns really start to unravel. because narcissism doesn't operate well in steady environments. It thrives in chaos, in emotional highs and lows, esteem in unpredictability. When things are inconsistent, the narcissist can rewrite the story in real time. When things become consistent, the story can no longer bend, esteem. A narcissistic person learns very quickly which version of you they can provoke. The apologetic one, the angry one, the guilty one, the one who will stay up all night trying to fix things. Esteem, if your responses change depending on their mood, they stay in control. But when your behavior becomes calm and predictable, when no always means no, esteem. When disengagement looks the same every time, you remove the lever they've been pulling. Consistency is not about being rigid. It's about being reliable to yourself, esteem. It's showing up the same way whether they're charming or cruel. And this is deeply unsettling to someone who depends on emotional volatility to maintain power, esteem. They can't play you against yourself anymore. At first, they will test it. They may push harder, change tactics, or suddenly act loving and reasonable. This isn't growth, it's data gathering, esteem. They're trying to see if this version of you will crack. And when it doesn't, the manipulation becomes visible, not just to you, but to the people around you. Esteem, here's why consistency is so revealing. Narcissistic manipulation relies on plausible deniability. They need the situation to look complicated. They need misunderstandings, esteem. Emotional outbursts, mixed signals. When you stay steady, their behavior starts to look exactly like what it is. There's no chaos left to hide behind. If they lash out, you respond calmly, esteem, or not at all. If they guilt trip, you don't defend yourself. If they love bomb, you don't rush back in. Over time, this pattern speaks for itself, and the contrast becomes undeniable, esteem. Your steadiness highlights their instability without you ever pointing it out. Many people struggle with consistency because it feels unnatural after long periods of emotional conditioning, esteem. You may feel tempted to be nice this time, to explain one more time, to make an exception because they seem sincere. But exceptions are exactly what narcissistic systems rely on, esteem. One opening and the whole pattern resets. Consistency is how you stop teaching people how to treat you badly. And there's another layer here that often goes unnoticed, esteem. When you are inconsistent, you absorb the blame. The narrative becomes, "My both contribute to the chaos." But when your behavior stays calm and measured, responsibility shifts. Esteem, the dysfunction can no longer be evenly distributed. One person is steady, one person is not, esteem. This is often when the narcissist starts accusing you of being robotic, cold, unfair. They're responding to the loss of emotional access, esteem. Your consistency removes their ability to provoke a reaction on demand. And for someone who equates control with connection, that feels threatening, esteem. What's powerful about consistency is that it protects you internally as much as it exposes the dynamic externally. You're no longer scanning for the right response, esteem. You're no longer bracing for the next mood shift. You already know how you'll respond because you've decided ahead of time. That decision frees up enormous mental energy. And let's be clear, esteem. Consistency doesn't mean tolerating abuse. It often means consistently disengaging, consistently not showing up for circular arguments, esteem. Consistently refusing to chase resolution with someone who thrives on confusion. This kind of predictability is grounding for you and deeply destabilizing for manipulation. People often ask, esteem, but won't they just tell others I'm distant or uncaring? They might, but consistency has a way of speaking louder than rumors. When your behavior remains calm over time, esteem, and their behavior continues to fluctuate, people notice. You don't have to correct the record, reality does that for you. And perhaps most importantly, esteem. Consistency rebuilds your relationship with yourself. You stop second-guessing. You stop breaking your own boundaries in moments of guilt or fear. You become someone you can trust again. Esteem, that inner trust, is what makes the next steps, detachment, action, self-focus possible. Narcissistic dynamics survive on confusion and emotional inconsistency. Calm, esteem, steady behavior removes both. And when the chaos no longer has a partner, it reveals exactly where it's coming from. Stay steady long enough, and the truth doesn't need your voice, esteem. It shows itself. Once you've learned to be silent and you've learned to stay consistent, something subtle but powerful begins to happen: emotional detachment, esteem. And this is often the point where people feel the most guilt, the most confusion, and the most fear, because detachment is misunderstood. It's mistaken for cruelty, for indifference, esteem, for becoming like them. But emotional detachment isn't about shutting your heart down. It's about taking your heart out of a dynamic that has been draining it dry, esteem. A narcissistic relationship is fueled by emotional supply. Your feelings, your hurt, your hope, your empathy, your longing become the energy source. When you're emotionally invested, esteem, everything matters more than it should. Every tone change, every delayed response, every subtle insult. You're constantly scanning, interpreting, adjusting. Detachment interrupts that process, esteem. It's the moment you stop making their behavior the center of your emotional universe. And here's the paradox: the less emotionally reactive you become, esteem, the more clearly their agenda shows itself. When you're deeply attached, manipulation can feel confusing. You wonder if you're being too sensitive. You second-guess your instincts, esteem. You explain away behavior because you're invested in the relationship surviving. But when you detach, the fog lifts. You start noticing patterns instead of isolated incidents, esteem. You see repetition instead of excuses. You stop asking, why would they do this? And start recognizing, this is what they do. Emotional detachment doesn't happen overnight, esteem. It's a gradual uncoupling. You still care, but you no longer collapse inward when they're displeased. You no longer rush to repair their discomfort, esteem. You no longer feel responsible for their moods. And this is often when the narcissist escalates, because the loss of emotional control feels like abandonment to them, esteem. Even if nothing has actually changed on the surface, they may provoke. They may accuse you of being distant or uncaring, esteem. They may suddenly play the victim or manufacture crisis to pull you back in emotionally. And this is where detachment becomes revealing. Because when you don't rush in, esteem, when you don't overfunction emotionally, their needs become starkly visible. The imbalance becomes undeniable. Detachment removes the illusion of mutuality. In healthy relationships, esteem, emotional closeness goes both ways. In narcissistic dynamics, emotional labor flows in one direction. You soothe, you empathize, you adapt. Detachment exposes that asymmetry, esteem. When you stop providing emotional regulation for someone else, they're left with their own discomfort, and many narcissistic individuals have very little tolerance for that, esteem. And let's be clear, detachment is not silent treatment. It's not withdrawal as punishment. It's presence without entanglement. You can still be polite. You can still be respectful, esteem. You can still show basic human decency. But you stop offering your inner emotional world as a bargaining chip. This is often when people worry they're becoming cold, esteem. But what's actually happening is regulation. You're no longer dysregulated by someone else's behavior. You're not numbing, you're stabilizing, esteem. You're choosing not to ride the emotional roller coaster anymore. And the impact of that choice is profound. When you're detached, gaslighting loses its power, esteem. You're not fighting to preserve a version of reality that someone else keeps distorting. You trust your perceptions. You observe instead of argue, esteem. You don't need them to agree with you in order to feel grounded. Detachment also changes how others see the dynamic. When you're no longer emotionally reactive, esteem, you stop looking volatile or overly sensitive. The contrast sharpens. One person remains measured. The other grows increasingly erratic. You don't have to call it out. Esteem, it becomes visible on its own. But perhaps the most important effect of emotional detachment is internal. You begin to feel space again, mental space, emotional space, esteem. You realize how much of your energy was tied up in monitoring, anticipating, and managing someone else. And as that energy returns to you, clarity follows, self-trust follows, peace follows, esteem. Detachment is not giving up on love, it's giving up on self-betrayal. And yes, detachment can lead to grief. You may mourn what you hoped the relationship could be, esteem. You may feel sadness over the emotional intimacy that never truly existed. But that grief is clean, it's honest. It's not mixed with confusion or manipulation. And clean grief heals, esteem. Narcissistic dynamics survive on emotional fusion, on blurred boundaries and entangled feelings. Detachment redraws those boundaries. It doesn't attack, it doesn't accuse, esteem. It simply steps back and lets the truth stand on its own. When you stop feeding the dynamic with your emotions, what remains is no longer your responsibility to fix, esteem. And that's when their agenda becomes unmistakably clear. And that's the moment you realize emotional distance isn't loss, it's liberation. After silence, consistency, esteem, and emotional detachment, there's a shift that often feels both empowering and unsettling. You stop explaining yourself. You let your actions do the talking, esteem. And for many people coming out of narcissistic dynamics, this is one of the hardest steps, not because it's unclear, but because you've been conditioned to believe that if you don't explain, esteem, you're being unfair. In narcissistic relationships, explanations become a trap. You explain why something hurt, and it turns into a debate about your tone. You explain a boundary, esteem, and it becomes a negotiation. You explain your needs, and suddenly you're accused of being demanding or dramatic. Every explanation opens the door to distortion. Over time, esteem. You learn that being understood is always just out of reach, but you keep trying anyway. Letting actions replace explanations ends that cycle. When you change how available you are, esteem. When you stop engaging in circular conversations, when you say no and don't justify it, you are communicating something very clear: access has changed. You're not punishing, esteem. You're not provoking, you're simply behaving in a way that protects your well-being. And the absence of explanation is what makes this so powerful. Explanations invite argument. esteem. Actions create reality. A narcissistic person depends on words because words can be twisted. Actions are harder to manipulate. You don't need to announce that you're pulling back. You just do. Esteem. You don't need to declare that a line has been crossed. You respond differently. You don't need to convince them that you deserve respect. You live as if you already believe it. Esteem. This often feels uncomfortable because it goes against how many of us were socialized. We were taught to be reasonable, to talk things through, to give people the benefit of the doubt. Esteem. And in healthy relationships, explanations can build understanding, but narcissistic dynamics aren't healthy. They are asymmetrical. One person explains, the other extracts, reframes esteem, and invalidates. When you stop explaining, the narcissist feels a loss of control. They may accuse you of being secretive, dismissive, or passive-aggressive. They may demand answers. Esteem. They may push harder for conversation. And this is where people get pulled back in because explaining feels like relief. It feels like doing the right thing. Esteem. But notice what happens when you don't. Your behavior becomes the message. Less access, less emotional labor, clear follow-through. Over time, the pattern speaks for itself. Esteem. You don't have to say, I'm not available for this anymore. Your availability tells the story. You don't have to say, I don't trust you. Your choices reflect that reality. Esteem. And here's the revealing part: when explanations stop, accountability becomes unavoidable. The narcissist can no longer hide behind confusion or miscommunication. The question is no longer, esteem, did you explain it well enough? The question becomes, why are your actions different now? And the answer points directly to the dynamic, not your delivery. Esteem. This shift also changes how others perceive you. When you stop over-explaining, you stop sounding defensive. You stop looking like you're trying to convince people of your worth. Esteem. There's a quiet confidence in actions that align with boundaries. People may not know the details, but they can sense the difference. And internally, something important happens. Esteem. You stop outsourcing your self-trust. You no longer need someone else to validate that your boundary is reasonable. You're not waiting for agreement to move forward. Esteem. You're acting in alignment with what you know to be true. Letting actions speak doesn't mean you never communicate. It means you communicate minimally and meaningfully. Esteem. You choose clarity over volume. You choose follow-through over persuasion. And you accept that not everyone needs to understand your boundaries for them to be valid. Esteem. This is especially powerful in narcissistic dynamics because explanation is often used as a delay tactic. As long as you're explaining, nothing has to change. When you act, esteem. Change is already happening. There is also a grief that comes with this step. You may realize how much you hoped that if you just found the right words, things would finally shift. Esteem. Letting go of explanations means letting go of that hope. And while that can feel painful, it's also honest. You stop investing energy in a fantasy and start investing in reality. Esteem. Actions don't argue, they don't persuade, they don't perform, they simply reflect your values. And when your behavior consistently reflects self-respect, esteem, the narcissistic mask doesn't fall because you exposed it, it falls because you stopped holding it in place. When words stop carrying the burden, truth shows up on its own. Esteem. By the time you stop explaining and let your actions speak, another quiet but powerful shift takes place. You step out of the role of managing someone else's image. Esteem. And this is where many narcissistic dynamics have been silently sustained for years, often without you even realizing it. Because protecting their reputation, smoothing over their behavior, esteem, and making sure others see the good has never been your responsibility. It was just made to feel that way. Narcissistic systems rely heavily on image, esteem. How things look matters more than how they actually are. The charm in public, the generosity on display, the carefully curated story about who they are and what they've endured, esteem. And behind the scenes, there's often confusion, emotional erosion, and a steady erosion of your reality. For a long time, you may have been the bridge between those two worlds, esteem, absorbing the impact privately while presenting something more polished publicly. Refusing to participate in image management doesn't mean you suddenly start exposing or attacking. Esteem, it means you stop covering, you stop explaining away their behavior, you stop rescuing them from the natural consequences of how they show up. And that alone can feel terrifying, esteem, because you may have been trained to believe that if you don't manage the optics, everything will fall apart. But what actually falls apart is the illusion. Esteem. Many people in narcissistic relationships become translators. Esteem. They didn't mean it like that. They're under a lot of stress. That's just how they communicate. These small acts of protection seem harmless, even kind. But over time, esteem. They distort reality, not just for others, but for you. You begin to doubt your own experiences because you've spent so much time softening them for everyone else. When you stop doing that, esteem, something remarkable happens. You don't have to say anything at all. You simply allow events to be what they are. You don't intervene to reframe. You don't jump in to defend, esteem. You don't rush to correct someone's impression. You let the behavior stand on its own. And narcissistic behavior does not age well without a handler. At first, esteem. This can feel deeply uncomfortable. You may worry about being seen as disloyal, cruel, or unfair. You may fear backlash. And yes, the narcissist will likely notice immediately. Esteem. Image management is a form of supply. When it's gone, they feel exposed. They may accuse you of betrayal. They may intensify their efforts to control the narrative. But here's the thing, esteem. When you stop protecting the image, you're not creating a false narrative. You're allowing an accurate one to emerge. This shift is especially powerful because it's passive, esteem. You're not campaigning. You're not venting. You're not making dramatic announcements. You're simply opting out of a role you were never meant to play. And that quiet withdrawal speaks volumes, esteem. Others begin to notice inconsistencies on their own, the charm that doesn't quite line up, the stories that change, the emotional reactions that feel disproportionate, esteem. You don't have to point it out. In fact, the less you say, the clearer it becomes. Because there's no longer a buffer absorbing the impact, esteem. Refusing to manage their image also restores something essential within you, integrity. You're no longer living a split life, one reality inside, another one presented outside, esteem. You're no longer complicit in minimizing harm. You're aligned, and alignment brings relief. This doesn't mean you owe everyone the full story. Privacy is still a boundary, esteem. But there's a difference between privacy and protection. Privacy is choosing what to share. Protection is hiding someone else's behavior at your own expense, esteem. When you step out of image management, you're choosing honesty without exposition, esteem. It's also important to recognize that narcissistic people often depend on others to carry their reputation for them. They outsource credibility. When that support is removed, esteem, their behavior becomes more visible and often more extreme as they try to regain control of how they're seen. That escalation is not your fault, esteem. It's the natural result of a system losing its scaffolding. And let's talk about the internal shift again, because that's where the real work happens. When you stop managing their image, esteem, you stop managing their emotions, you stop preemptively fixing, smoothing, or excusing. That frees up an enormous amount of energy that can now be used for clarity, healing, esteem, and growth. You also begin to realize something important: people who only think well of someone because you're constantly translating and justifying aren't seeing the full picture anyway, esteem. You're not responsible for maintaining an illusion that costs you your peace. Over time, the narcissist's mask doesn't fall because you pulled it off, esteem. It falls because no one is holding it in place anymore. And when you stop protecting an image that was never yours to defend, the truth finally has room to breathe, esteem. After everything we've talked about: silence, consistency, detachment, letting actions speak, and stepping out of image management, the final shift may seem almost anticlimactic, esteem, but it is the most powerful of all. You turn your focus back to yourself, not in a dramatic look at me way, not as a performance, but in a quiet, sustained redirection of energy, esteem. And this is often the moment when the narcissistic dynamic truly collapses. Narcissistic systems are organized around one central rule: they must remain the center of emotion, esteem, of meaning. Your thoughts revolve around them. Your reactions orbit them. Your plans adjust to accommodate them. Even your healing for a long time may still be about understanding them, esteem. And as long as that remains true, the system stays intact. Self-focus breaks that gravity. When you begin prioritizing your peace, your health, your goals, your growth without announcing it, esteem, without asking permission, you remove yourself from the role they depended on you to play. You stop being the audience. You stop being the regulator. You stop being the emotional anchor, esteem. And this isn't something they can argue with because it doesn't involve them directly at all. This is often when people feel a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief, esteem, because life feels quieter and more grounded. Fear, because narcissistic dynamics train you to believe that choosing yourself is dangerous, selfish, or cruel, esteem. But choosing yourself isn't an attack, it's a return. As your focus shifts inward, something becomes very clear. The narcissist notices not because you did something wrong, esteem, but because you're no longer oriented toward them. They may suddenly reach out more. They may criticize your independence. They may accuse you of abandoning them or changing. And in a way, esteem, they're right, you have changed. You've stopped feeding a dynamic that required your self-neglect to survive. What's revealing here is how threatened they become by your growth, esteem. Healthy people adapt when someone evolves. Narcissistic systems destabilize. Your self-focus shines a light on how much access they expected to have and how little they offered in return, esteem. And this is where the unmasking becomes unmistakable. When you invest in your life, your friendships, your creativity, your work, your healing, esteem, you're no longer waiting for crumbs of validation. You're no longer hoping they'll finally show up differently. You're building something that exists independently of them, esteem. And that independence exposes the fragility of the narcissistic bond. It was never mutual, it was dependent. Self-focus also changes how you respond, esteem. You're less reactive because your identity is no longer on the line. You're less entangled because your sense of worth isn't tied to their approval. You're not watching them as closely, esteem, and that's exactly what makes their behavior stand out more clearly. When you stop monitoring, you start seeing. And here's something important: self-focus is not avoidance, esteem. It's engagement with your own life. It's choosing to put energy where it actually produces growth rather than depletion, esteem. It's recognizing that healing doesn't come from understanding the narcissist better. It comes from understanding yourself again. As this shift settles in, esteem, many people notice something almost unsettling. The narcissist begins to feel smaller. Not because you diminish them, but because you're no longer magnifying them, esteem. Their moods no longer dictate your day. Their opinions no longer dominate your decisions. Their reactions no longer define your reality. That's not cruelty. That's proportion, esteem. Self-focus also allows grief to complete itself. You grieve what you hoped for. You grieve the version of the relationship that never existed. But you're no longer stuck in longing, esteem. You're moving forward. And forward motion is something narcissistic dynamics cannot tolerate because they rely on stagnation and repetition, esteem. And perhaps the most radical part of self-focus is this: it doesn't require closure. You don't need an apology. You don't need acknowledgement, esteem. You don't need them to finally admit what they did. Your life becomes the closure. Your peace becomes the resolution. Over time, others notice the change too, esteem. Not because you're talking about it, but because you're different, calmer, more grounded, less preoccupied. The contrast is striking. One person is building, esteem. The other is still circling the same patterns. You didn't expose anything. You simply moved on. And that's the final truth of unmasking a narcissist without saying a word, esteem. The mask falls when you stop living your life in reaction to theirs. When you choose yourself consistently and quietly, the truth doesn't need confrontation. It reveals itself.